Elderly librarian tutors struggling teen for free, not knowing he'll become her future heart surgeon. Margaret Winters often thought about this strange twist of fate as she shelved books in the quiet corners of Oak Ridge Public Library, how a single decision, made on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 27 years ago, had somehow folded time into a perfect circle of reciprocity. The library's ancient heating system rattled and wheezed like an asthmatic dragon. Outside, November rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, transforming the afternoon light into something watery and thin. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 68, the cold seemed to find her bones more easily, settling into the spaces between her vertebrae like unwelcome guests. "Mrs. Winters?" Cheryl, the front desk assistant, poked her head around the biography section. "That boy is back again. The one who keeps falling asleep in the medical reference section." Margaret nodded, shelving the last of her cart's books with practiced precision. She knew exactly which boy Cheryl meant. For 3 weeks now, she'd observed him, a lanky teenager with perpetually untied shoelaces and dark circles under his eyes that reminded her of bruised fruit. He would arrive after school, claiming the same back corner table, surrounded by textbooks that seemed too advanced for someone his age. "I'll handle it," Margaret said, smoothing down her silver bob with one hand. The boy's name was Daniel Torres. Margaret had learned this not from conversation, the boy barely spoke, but from the school ID card he used to check out books. As she approached his table, she noticed his head was down again, cheek pressed against an open textbook, shoulders rising and falling in the slow rhythm of sleep. For a moment, she simply watched him. There was something about his vulnerability that tugged at a place deep inside her chest, a hollow space that had existed since Thomas died 5 years ago. Since her husband's passing, Margaret had retreated further into her books and her routines, speaking only when necessary, living in the quiet margins of her own life. She cleared her throat softly. "Young man?" Daniel startled awake, blinking rapidly, a momentary flash of fear crossing his face before he registered her presence. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, straightening and rubbing his eyes. "I was just resting them for a second." "You've been resting them quite often lately," Margaret replied, her voice gentler than she'd intended. Her eyes caught on his textbook, Advanced Biology, open to a chapter on the human circulatory system. Next to it lay scattered papers with half-completed math equations. "You seem to be studying quite advanced material." Daniel's shoulders hunched defensively. "I'm not causing any trouble." "I didn't say you were." Margaret hesitated, noticing for the first time how thin his jacket looked, how the cuffs were frayed and too short for his wrists. "But the library closes in 20 minutes, and you haven't made much progress since you fell asleep 40 minutes ago." A flush crept up the boy's neck. "I'll go," he said, hastily gathering his papers. "That isn't—" Margaret paused, feeling a strange reluctance to see him leave. "That's not what I meant." She gestured to the chair across from him. "May I?" Confusion flickered across his face, but he nodded. Margaret lowered herself into the chair, her knees protesting slightly. "I couldn't help but notice you're studying cardiac anatomy," she said, nodding toward his textbook. "That's university-level material." Something changed in the boy's expression, a small light coming on behind his eyes. "It's for the science competition, the one where the winner gets a college scholarship." He hesitated, then added, "I need to win it." The way he said need, not want, told Margaret everything. She recognized that particular hunger, having seen it in her own mirror decades ago when she'd worked her way through library science school after her parents told her they wouldn't waste money educating a daughter. "And the math?" she asked, gesturing to his scattered papers. Daniel's shoulders slumped. That's where I'm falling behind. If my GPA drops below 3.5, I won't even qualify for the competition." Margaret considered this information carefully. In her 43 years as a librarian, she'd developed an ability to read people as thoroughly as she read books. This boy wasn't lazy, he was exhausted and determined. "I used to teach mathematics," she said quietly, "before I became a librarian." This wasn't entirely true. She'd tutored mathematics to pay her way through school, but something made her want to offer this boy more credibility, more reason to accept what she was about to propose. "I could help you," she continued, surprising herself. "With the mathematics, I mean." Daniel stared at her, suspicion narrowing his dark eyes. "Why would you do that?" It was a fair question. Why would she? Margaret had lived the past 5 years in a carefully constructed routine: work, home, books, sleep, repeat. She volunteered at the hospital on Sundays, reading to patients in the cardiac ward, but otherwise kept to herself. Even her colleagues at the library had stopped inviting her to their gatherings after too many polite refusals. Because, Margaret said slowly, sometimes we all need a little help. She thought of Thomas then, how he'd encouraged her to finish her degree when she'd wanted to quit, how he'd believed in her capabilities long before she did. No charge. Just 2 hours, twice a week after my shift ends. Daniel's fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on his textbook. I can't pay you. I didn't ask for payment. Nothing's free, he countered, a hard edge to his voice that seemed too old for his young face. Margaret smiled slightly. Knowledge is. That's what libraries are for. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows and the distant hum of the building's heating system struggling against the November chill. Daniel studied her face as if searching for some hidden agenda, some trap he couldn't yet see. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. Tuesdays and Thursdays? 5 to 7, Margaret confirmed, rising from her chair. We'll start tomorrow. Don't be late. As she walked away, Margaret felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. That night, as she moved through her empty house with its 2 quiet rooms and shelves of untouched books, she found herself wondering about the boy with the untied shoelaces and the desperate need to succeed. Little did she know that this simple decision, made partly out of compassion, partly out of loneliness, would set in motion events that would eventually save her life. Daniel Torres walked home in the rain, hunched against the cold, his mind replaying the strange conversation with the elderly librarian, Mrs. Winters. Even her name sounded cold, matching her precise movements and formal speech. Yet there had been something in her eyes, a flash of understanding that made him think maybe, just maybe, she wasn't offering help just to have someone to boss around. The small apartment was dark when he arrived, which meant his mother was working her second shift at the diner. He unlocked the door, stepping into the perpetual chill that never seemed to leave their home no matter how high they set the thermostat. The building was old, the windows drafty, and the landlord indifferent to complaints. In the refrigerator, he found a covered plate, leftover spaghetti with a sticky note attached in his mother's handwriting. Eat all of it. Love you. 3 words that somehow made the cold apartment feel warmer. Daniel microwaved the pasta and sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by the medical textbooks he'd checked out from the library. His mother didn't know he'd been staying after school for detention, punishment for falling asleep in class again. She worked so hard, picking up extra shifts to keep them afloat after his father had left 3 years ago, that Daniel couldn't bear to add to her worries. The science competition was his secret plan: win the scholarship, get into pre-med, become a doctor, and finally give his mother the life she deserved. A life where she didn't have to work 60-hour weeks serving coffee to people who didn't bother to learn her name. But math was becoming his downfall. Numbers swam before his eyes, rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking. His last test had come back with a red 68% circled at the top, his teacher's note suggesting he consider getting help or choosing a less demanding career path. As if it were that simple. As if dreams were interchangeable parts that could be swapped out when one proved too difficult. Daniel pushed his half-eaten spaghetti away and opened his math textbook. Maybe the old librarian could actually help. Or maybe she'd give up on him after one session, like his last math teacher had, telling him some people just aren't wired for numbers. Either way, he had nothing to lose. Margaret arrived at the library 30 minutes earlier than usual the next day. She'd spent the evening pulling out her old mathematics textbooks from the spare room closet, dust tickling her nose as she flipped through pages filled with Thomas's neat marginal notes. He'd been the mathematician in their marriage, a professor who could make even the most complex equations seem like poetry. "What would you think of me now, Thomas?" she murmured to the empty room. Playing teacher again after all these years. Now, as she arranged the study table in the library's quiet corner, setting out pencils, paper, and the practice problems she'd prepared, Margaret felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. What if the boy didn't show up? What if he did, but she couldn't help him? It had been decades since she'd tutored anyone. At precisely 5 o'clock, Daniel appeared, his hair damp from what must have been a quick run through the rain. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the table, backpack clutched against his chest like a shield. "You came," Margaret said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "You said don't be late." He shrugged, dropping his backpack and sliding into the chair across from her. Their first session began tentatively. Margaret asked to see his recent assignments, wincing internally at the red marks scattered across his work. But as she studied his approach to the problems, she realized something important. Daniel wasn't struggling with mathematical concepts. He was rushing, taking shortcuts, missing steps. "You understand the material," she said, tapping his paper, "but you're making careless errors because you're trying to solve everything in your head." Daniel frowned. "Writing everything out takes too long. And making mistakes costs you points," Margaret countered. "Mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer, it's about proving you know how to get there." For the next 2 hours, Margaret guided him through problem after problem, insisting he write down each step, checking his work frequently. By the end of their session, Daniel had successfully completed an entire set of practice problems with only 2 minor errors. "Not bad for a first attempt," Margaret said, allowing herself a small smile. Daniel stared at his completed work, a look of cautious surprise on his face. That wasn't as horrible as I thought it would be." "High praise indeed," Margaret replied dryly, but there was warmth in her voice. As Daniel packed up his things, Margaret noticed him glancing at the clock. "Is someone waiting for you?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, my mom works late. I just need to catch the 7:15 bus or I have to wait another hour for the next one." Margaret hesitated, then said, "I drive right past the bus stop on my way home. I could give you a ride if you'd like." The offer surprised them both. Margaret hadn't given anyone a ride in her car since Thomas died. The passenger seat had become a repository for library books and grocery bags, anything to fill the empty space where her husband used to sit. Daniel seemed equally taken aback. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Margaret said, gathering her things. "But it's raining, and waiting for buses in the rain is miserable. Consider it payment for being a cooperative student." 10 minutes later, they were in Margaret's old Volvo, wipers beating a steady rhythm against the windshield. Daniel sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his backpack on his lap, looking out at the rain-blurred town. "Turn left at the light," he directed, his voice barely audible over the car's heater. "Then right at the gas station." Margaret followed his directions, noting how the neighborhoods gradually changed, neat houses with trimmed lawns giving way to apartment buildings with security bars on the ground floor windows. When Daniel indicated a shabby 4-story building with peeling paint, Margaret pulled to the curb. "This is me," Daniel said, hand already on the door handle. He hesitated, then added, "Thanks for the ride and the help." "Thursday," Margaret reminded him. 5 o'clock. Daniel nodded once, then dashed through the rain to the building's entrance. Margaret watched until he disappeared inside, a strange protective feeling washing over her. She sat there for a moment longer, rain drumming on the roof of her car, wondering what had possessed her to involve herself in this boy's life. As she drove home to her empty house, Margaret realized she felt more alert, more present than she had in years. The numbness that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death had receded, if only slightly. It was as if a window had been cracked open in a room that had been sealed shut for too long, allowing the faintest hint of fresh air to circulate. Perhaps, she thought, she wasn't helping Daniel Torres solely out of altruism. Perhaps she needed this connection as much as he needed to learn mathematics. Their twice-weekly sessions continued through December and into January. What began as strictly mathematics tutoring gradually expanded to include discussions of Daniel's biology studies, particularly his fascination with cardiac medicine. Margaret found herself bringing in relevant books from the library's collection and occasionally ordering specialized texts he couldn't find elsewhere. "My father had heart problems," Daniel confided one evening in late January as they sat surrounded by diagrams of the human heart. Outside, snow fell silently, transforming the library's windows into glowing rectangles of white light. "That's why I want to be a heart surgeon." Margaret looked up from the article she was reading. In the 3 months they'd been working together, Daniel had never mentioned his father. "Is that why he's not around?" she asked carefully. Daniel's face hardened. He left when I was 14. Said he needed to find himself." His fingers made bitter air quotes around the words. "But before that, when I was little, he had a heart attack. I was 7. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room with my mom, watching all these doctors rushing around and thinking they were like superheroes." He traced the outline of the heart diagram with his finger. "They fixed him, made him better. I thought that was the most amazing thing in the world, being able to fix someone's heart." Margaret felt a tightness in her own chest. "And now? Now I know hearts are complicated." Daniel said, looking up at her with eyes that seemed older than his 17 years. Not just the physical ones, but the other kind too. Some breaks can't be fixed with surgery. The wisdom in his words caught Margaret off guard. No, she agreed softly. Some can't. A comfortable silence fell between them as they returned to their work. Margaret found herself thinking of Thomas, of the heart attack that had taken him from her so suddenly. The cruel irony that a man who'd spent his life working with numbers had become just another statistic, one of the thousands of Americans who die from heart disease each year. Mrs. Winters? Daniel's voice broke into her thoughts. Are you okay? Margaret realized she'd been staring blankly at the same page for several minutes. Yes, just thinking. My husband, Thomas, he died of a heart attack 5 years ago. It was the first time she'd mentioned Thomas to Daniel, though his presence was often there in their sessions, in the mathematics books Margaret brought, in certain phrases she used that had been his. Daniel's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry. It was very sudden, Margaret continued, surprising herself with the desire to speak about it. He was grading papers one moment and the next. She shook her head. The doctor said he was gone before the ambulance even arrived. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, That's why I need to learn everything I can. So maybe I can save someone else's Thomas someday. The simple sincerity in his voice made Margaret's eyes sting. She busied herself organizing their papers, using the moment to compose herself. Well, she said finally, then we'd better make sure you understand cardiac arrhythmias before your science competition next month, hadn't we? As their session ended and they gathered their things to leave, Margaret noticed Daniel lingering, seemingly reluctant to go. Is something wrong? She asked. No, it's just, he fidgeted with the zipper on his jacket. Tomorrow's my birthday. I'm turning 18. Oh, Margaret smiled. Happy early birthday then. Thanks. He hesitated, then blurted, My mom's working a double shift, so I was going to just get pizza or something, but I wondered if maybe, if you're not busy, we could have our Thursday session anyway? Even though it's not a regular school day because of the teacher workshop? The request hung in the air between them. Margaret realized with a start that Daniel had no one to spend his 18th birthday with, a milestone that should be celebrated, not marked with solitary pizza in an empty apartment. Actually, she said, I was thinking we might need a change of scenery. The library closes early tomorrow for staff development. Perhaps we could have our session at my house instead. I make a rather good lasagna, if you're interested. Daniel's face brightened, a smile transforming his usually serious expression. That would be great. It's settled then, Margaret said, trying to ignore the warm feeling expanding in her chest. I'll pick you up at the usual time. That night, as Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she wondered what Thomas would think about her inviting a student to their home that had been so quiet for so long. She could almost hear his chuckle, could almost feel the way he would have squeezed her hand and said, About time you let some life back in, Maggie. For the first time in years, the memory didn't bring only pain. There was something else mixed in with it now, a bittersweet warmth, like sunshine filtering through rain. Daniel's birthday dinner transformed something in their relationship. Seated at Margaret's dining room table, a table that hadn't hosted guests since Thomas's funeral reception, they shared lasagna, garlic bread, and conversation that extended far beyond mathematics and cardiac medicine. Margaret learned about Daniel's childhood in Arizona before his family moved to Ohio, about his mother who had immigrated from Mexico with dreams of becoming a nurse but had never found the time or money to return to school, about his collection of medical journals that he kept under his bed like other boys might keep comic books or sports magazines. In turn, she found herself sharing stories about Thomas, about their travels together, about the lifetime they'd built in this house with its overflowing bookshelves and creaky hardwood floors. She even brought out photo albums, dusty from disuse, showing Daniel pictures of a younger Margaret with dark hair and bright eyes, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a crooked smile. You look happy, Daniel observed, studying a photo of Margaret and Thomas on their 20th anniversary trip to Maine. We were, Margaret said simply. Then, after a moment's reflection, she added, I was. The past tense hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that happiness wasn't a permanent state, but something that could be lost and perhaps found again in different forms. Before Daniel left that evening, Margaret presented him with a small package wrapped in blue paper. You didn't have to get me anything, he protested, but his fingers were already carefully opening the gift. Inside was a book, an advanced text on cardiovascular surgery that Margaret had ordered online after noticing Daniel's fascination with a similar title in the library's reference section. Daniel ran his fingers over the embossed cover. This must have been expensive. Consider it an investment, Margaret replied. In your future. What neither of them said, but both understood, was that it was also an investment in their continuing relationship, an acknowledgement that their connection had become something more than tutor and student, something that resembled friendship, or perhaps even family. As winter melted into spring, their sessions continued, but with a new dimension. Sometimes they worked at the library, sometimes at Margaret's house. Occasionally, when Daniel's mother had a rare day off, Margaret would join them for dinner at their apartment, bringing dessert and books that she thought Daniel might enjoy. Elena Torres, a petite woman with the same intense dark eyes as her son, had been wary of Margaret at first, suspicious of this elderly white woman who had taken such an interest in her son. But as she witnessed the transformation in Daniel, his improving grades, his growing confidence, his genuine affection for the librarian, her suspicion gave way to gratitude. He smiles now. Elena told Margaret one evening as they washed dishes together after dinner, Daniel absorbed in a new medical text in the next room. Before you, it had been so long since I'd seen him really smile. Margaret understood. She'd seen the same change in herself when she looked in the mirror each morning, the gradual softening of the tight lines around her mouth, the return of color to cheeks that had been pale for too long. In March, Daniel won second place in the regional science competition, not first as he'd hoped, but enough to qualify him for the state finals in April. His project on innovative approaches to valve replacement surgery impressed the judges, earning him a small scholarship and, more importantly, the attention of several university representatives. I couldn't have done it without you, he told Margaret as they celebrated with ice cream sundaes at the small parlor near the library. Nonsense, Margaret replied. You did the work. I just made sure you showed your steps. Daniel shook his head, uncharacteristically insistent. No, it's more than that. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions. I knew what I wanted, but I didn't believe I could actually get there. You made me believe it was possible. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Well, she said softly, you've done the same for me. What do you mean? She stirred her ice cream, watching it melt into swirls of vanilla and caramel. After Thomas died, I stopped living. I was existing, but I wasn't really present in my own life. Then you came along with your untied shoelaces and your determination, and... She smiled, blinking back unexpected tears. And suddenly I had a reason to care again. To be invested in something beyond just getting through each day. Daniel looked down at his own dessert, clearly moved but uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. So we helped each other, he said simply. Yes, Margaret agreed. We helped each other. In April, Daniel won the state science competition. In May, he graduated as salutatorian of his high school class. Margaret sat with Elena in the audience, both women dabbing at tears as Daniel delivered a speech about perseverance and the power of unexpected connections. There are people who come into our lives when we least expect it, he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. People who believe in us when we've stopped believing in ourselves. People who show us that family isn't just about blood, it's about who chooses to stay by your side when things get difficult. His eyes found Margaret in the crowd, and she felt the familiar warmth expand in her chest, that feeling of purpose and connection that had been absent for so long. That summer, as Daniel prepared to begin his undergraduate studies at Ohio State University on a combination of scholarships and grants, he and Margaret continued to meet regularly. No longer for tutoring, Daniel had proven he could excel academically on his own, but for companionship, for the easy comfort they found in each other's presence. I'll be back on weekends, Daniel promised as August approached, helping Margaret plant bulbs in her garden that would bloom the following spring. And holidays. It's only a 2-hour drive. You'll be busy, Margaret replied, patting soil around a tulip bulb. New friends, new experiences. That's as it should be. Still, Daniel insisted, I'll come back. And he did. Throughout his undergraduate years, Daniel returned to visit at least once a month. Sometimes he brought laundry and homework, sometimes just himself and stories of his classes, his part-time job at the university hospital, his growing certainty that cardiac surgery was his calling. Margaret's house became his second home, a quiet place to study during exam periods, a refuge when dormitory life became too chaotic. He had his own room there, the former guest room that Margaret had redecorated with a desk and bookshelves, walls adorned with anatomical charts, and a framed certificate from his science competition victory. For Margaret, these years brought a gentle revival. She continued working at the library, but also began volunteering more actively at the hospital's cardiac ward, reading to patients and offering comfort to families in waiting rooms. She joined a book club, reconnected with old friends, and even traveled to Europe, a trip she and Thomas had always planned but never taken. "You seem younger," Cheryl remarked one day at the library. "Happier." Margaret considered this as she shelved books. "Not younger," she decided, "just more alive." When Daniel was accepted to medical school, the first in his family to pursue an advanced degree, Margaret and Elena hosted a celebration dinner together, their initial wariness having long since transformed into a warm friendship built on their shared pride in Daniel. "To the future Dr. Torres," Margaret toasted, raising her glass. "To the two women who made it possible," Daniel countered, his eyes bright with emotion. The years of medical school were harder, longer periods between visits, shorter stays when he did come home. But there were still holiday gatherings, still late-night phone calls when Daniel needed to vent about difficult professors or challenging rotations, still Margaret's unwavering belief in his abilities. When Daniel specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, no one was surprised. When he was accepted to one of the most prestigious residency programs in the country, everyone celebrated. And when, after years of grueling training, he returned to Ohio to join the surgical staff at University Hospital, the same hospital where Thomas had died, the same hospital where Daniel had first dreamed of becoming a doctor, it felt like the completion of a circle. "Why come back here?" Margaret asked him over dinner the night he received his official offer letter. "You could work anywhere in the country now." Daniel looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "Because this is home," he said simply. "Because the people I care about are here." Margaret felt that familiar warmth again, the one that had become her constant companion over the years of knowing Daniel. At 79, she was slower now, her silver hair thinner, her hands more veined and spotted. But her mind remained sharp, her spirit more vibrant than it had been even a decade earlier. "Well," she said, smiling, "I suppose that's a good enough reason." The chest pain began on a Tuesday afternoon, a dull pressure that Margaret initially dismissed as indigestion. By evening, it had intensified, radiating down her left arm in a way that even she, with her limited medical knowledge, recognized as potentially serious. Still, she hesitated to call anyone. Daniel was scheduled to perform an important surgery the next morning, his first solo valve replacement as attending surgeon. Elena was visiting her sister in Arizona. It could wait until morning, Margaret told herself, taking an aspirin and going to bed early. But the pain woke her at 3 a.m., sharper now, accompanied by a cold sweat and a sensation of dread. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. Everything after that became a blur of sirens, urgent voices, bright lights, and the steady beep of monitors. Emergency room. EKG, words like myocardial infarction, and needs immediate intervention. Call doctor. Torres. She managed to tell a nurse. Daniel Torres. Cardiothoracic. He should know. Then darkness. Margaret woke to the sound of steady beeping and the sensation of something warm holding her hand. She opened her eyes slowly, vision clearing to reveal Daniel sitting beside her hospital bed, still wearing surgical scrubs, his face drawn with worry. "You're supposed to be in surgery," were her first words, voice raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. Daniel's exhausted face broke into a relieved smile. "I was. I finished just in time to take over yours." Margaret blinked, trying to process his words. "You were my surgeon?" He nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Triple bypass. You gave us quite a scare, Mrs. Winters." Margaret, she corrected automatically, a decades-old exchange between them. Then the reality of the situation sank in. "You operated on my heart." "I did," Daniel confirmed. "And you'll be happy to know it's a strong heart. Stronger than it has any right to be, according to your age and medical history. The repairs we made should give you many more good years." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. "How strange life is," she whispered, "that the boy who once fell asleep in my library would one day hold my heart in his hands." Daniel's own eyes glistened. "I told you I was going to save someone's Thomas someday. I just didn't know it would be by saving you." For a long moment they sat in silence, the full circle of their journey settling around them like a comfortable blanket. The elderly librarian who had once tutored a struggling teen for free, not knowing he would become her future heart surgeon. It sounded like the plot of one of the novels Margaret so loved to recommend to her patrons. "You know," Daniel said finally, "when I was in there, working on your heart, I kept thinking about all those afternoons in the library. How you taught me to slow down, to show my work, to be methodical." "I hope you weren't too methodical," Margaret quipped weakly. "I understand speed is somewhat important in these situations." Daniel laughed, the sound chasing away some of the clinical sterility of the hospital room. "Let's just say I found the perfect balance, careful but efficient, just like you taught me." As Margaret drifted back to sleep, comforted by the presence of this extraordinary young man who had become like a son to her, she thought about the strange symmetry of their relationship, how they had saved each other in different ways, she by believing in his potential, he by literally mending her broken heart. And isn't that, she thought as consciousness faded, what family really means? Not just shared blood or names, but shared hearts, the willingness to hold another's heart carefully, to repair it when broken, to help it beat stronger than before. In the quiet hospital room, with Daniel keeping faithful watch, Margaret Winters slept peacefully, her newly repaired heart beating with a steady rhythm, a rhythm that seemed to whisper of second chances, of unexpected connections, of lives intertwined by fate and choice, and the simple decision to help a stranger on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Outside, spring sunshine broke through morning clouds, casting golden light through the window, illuminating two people whose lives had become a perfect circle of reciprocity, a testament to how the smallest acts of kindness can sometimes lead to the most profound forms of healing.